Hey everyone, and welcome to my full in-depth guide to Galio. In case you're new to the channel, I'm a multi-rank 1 challenger mid laner and also played pro play for 4.5 years. Galio is a champ that works really well in the current meta with the AD junglers, and he's also quite good up against assassins, so if you do struggle with those, it can be a nice champ to have in your pool. He's also really good for working on your decision making and your roaming, so if those are things that you're working on, you might consider adding Galio for that reason as well. Let's start off with Galio's starting items. So your three choices are Doran's Ring, 2 potions, Corrupting Potion, or Dark Seal Refillable. So if you're in a very easy matchup, you can look to go Dark Seal Refillable, especially easy melee matchups. So if you're versus something like Fizz that can't really harass you early and also doesn't have good enough all-in to punish you, then this is like the greediest option you can start with. At the same time, you shouldn't be too greedy on this champ. Like Galio's very early lane is quite weak because you don't really have the wave clear yet to just force everyone under tower. Now, I definitely wouldn't do it against ranged champs. I guess maybe if you're versus something like Veigar where they can't really harass you either, could look for something like that. But most of the time, if I'm in an even matchup or if I'm not sure what to start, I'll just start with the Doran's Ring. It gives you the mana and it gives you the AP that just makes it a lot easier to play the early game. And obviously having the 2 potions makes you slightly stronger before that first phase. If you're in a very difficult, especially range matchups, a lot of time I go for Corrupting Potion because it's going to add up to a lot of extra sustain over the lane, and it's going to make a really big difference if it's a champ that pokes you really often. Now the question you might have is, where is Doran's Shield? So Doran's Shield, in my opinion, is a bit of a bait on Galio because a lot of the time, unlike other melees, you actually have an ability to CS from range. Like you can Q the creeps, for example. So I normally find that having more mana from Corrupting Part or Doran's Ring makes it a bit easier to neutralize most range matchups compared to the Doran's Shield. However, if you're in a lane where you can't really access the wave at all, like if you're playing against something like Lucian or Vayne or Tristana, in those sort of matchups, you might want to look to go Doran's Shield instead, because it's going to be very difficult for you to walk up to the wave without taking damage. But for the most part, I would look to start with these. So default to Doran's Ring. If you're really ready, go Dark Seal. Otherwise, if you're in a hard matchup, go for the Corrupting Pot. For early buys, we have a ton of different options because there are a ton of different viable mythics on Galio, which we'll get to. But I think the most important thing is that if you didn't start Refillable, you probably should try pick it up early. Galio is a champ that, because he's short ranged, is always going to take damage. So that means having the extra sustain from Refillable makes a big difference. And it's very cheap, so I like to pick it up. Dark Seal as well is very good on Galio because a lot of the time you will have a lot of KP and you also have great AoE. So it's a great item to buy on pretty much every AP champ. It is slightly riskier maybe on Galio because you have a chance of dying pretty much always, just by nature of being a like melee engaged champ. But I think normally I can keep the stacks up on this pretty high, and you are reasonably tanky, so I think it's still good. Depending on your rune page, like you might have magical boots, you might not, but we're kind of assuming you don't. And tier 1 boots are really good on Galio because most of the time you will be roaming at least into the river, if not to other lanes completely. And having the extra movement speed to dodge skill shots early game is very valuable, especially in mage matchups. So those are kind of your small components out of the way. After that, it's really going to depend like what mythic you're going and what matchup you're in. So my kind of thinking is that if in most matchups, I try and prioritize AP. And the reason is that if you have enough AP, you can one-shot the back wave with 1Q, especially if you're taking DMAT as well. And that can speed up your wave clear to the point where your opponent can't really interact with you at all. If you're up against like more assassin-esque champs though, and you're worried about being all in, you probably want to look for one of these three. Like Catalyst makes you pretty much invulnerable to any kind of all-in champs. If you're looking to build Everfrost or something instead, Kindle Gem is basically the equivalent if you're not going for Rod of Ages. And against like double AP mid jungles or CC mids, so your Zoes, Lissandras, Syndras, etc., Merc Treads gets a lot of value. So these three, it kind of just depends like what mythic you're going and what what mythic you're going and what matchup you're in. But for the most part, you are trying to pick up at least a little bit of AP, unless you're worried that you won't be tanky enough to survive the all-in without it. For boot options, you have similar options to a lot of the other mids, except you have steel caps as well. So most of the time on Galio, I would say you actually should be going either like a Merc Treads or Lucidity boost. I would say like steel caps and Sork Shoes are a bit more unlikely. But the times you might be going for them is Sork Shoes obviously is very valuable if you're the solo AP, but it's not as good as other champions because a lot of your kind of damage will come from your engage, and I think it's a lot easier to get consistent engages with the flash cooldown given from Lucidity. If you have Ghost as well, you should definitely be taking Lucidity most of the time. So I kind of prefer these. They're cheaper and I think they're better on Galio, but there is an option for Sork Shoes if you really want it. And then Merc Treads and Steel Caps. I think Merc Treads are a lot better than Steel Caps overall, but if they do have like a ton of AD on their team, especially AD auto attackers, then you can look to itemize Steel Caps, and it's going to make you very difficult to deal with in the early game. So I'd say I actually have like a fair balance of these. I probably prioritize Lucidity boots and Mercs the most, but I definitely find myself picking up like all 4 of these boots at some time on the champ. If you just want to default to something, probably just go Lucidity every game. Like I think there's room for optimization, but it's honestly not a huge deal. For your standard builds, we have a couple different ones. So the ones I've looked at is the Everfrost and the Roa. Bear in mind, there are a lot of different viable mythics on Galio, so we'll get to that. The first one is the Everfrost build. So this is the build that I prefer the most for solo queue because it spikes a little bit earlier, and I think having the Everfrost active makes it a lot easier to kind of set up CC chains. So I like opt to go for the Everfrost. After that, I go my tier 2 boots of choice, so that could be any of these 4 depending on the game. After that, I kind of go a defensive item of my choice. So this could be a Zhonya's, it could be a Banshee's, it could even be Cosmic. Like you're happy to do it this way around as well. If you wanted more damage, this could even be a Shadow Flame. But I think normally on Galio, like Zhonya's is very valuable because you're going to be in the middle of the team. Obviously, if you're against heavy AP though, it doesn't really make sense. Like you might go say Everfrost, Mercs, Banshee's, Cosmic. Like that's completely fine. You can go Banshee's and Zhonya's if you really want for extra kind of CC, or sorry, extra tankiness. But this is what I'd go most of the time, and normally as most AP champs, you pick up Rabadon's third as opposed to like Cosmic, but in my opinion, if you're going like Everfrost and Zhonya's, like you need to delay it by an additional item because you're going to be pretty low on the AP, and again, you're not getting a lot of AP from your runes, so it makes it difficult to pick up earlier, and just by the nature of being like a melee champion, having more resistances is very nice because you're always going to take damage, so something like this works out very well. If you want to go the Rod of Ages build, it definitely scales better, and because it gives more AP, it gives you the option of going Rabadon's third, so it's higher damage overall, but it does spike later. Like you're definitely looking for more a 3-item spike as opposed to like a 1-2-item spike, so that's why I don't think it's as good in solo queue. But if you like, there's nothing really wrong with it, it's just kind of personal preference. You might find that this is easier for you to play if you really value having the scaling, or you find your games are going really, really long, you might find that Rod of Ages is just better. And I would say that Rod of Ages does make your lane phase a little easier because you have the option of just going for AP or like sustain. Whereas like if you're going for something like Everfrost, like Kindle Gem is not quite as good a defensive item as Catalyst. And yeah, you can go for the chapter, but it's a lot more expensive, say, than just going for like a Blast 1-item tome. So it's kind of up to you. Like I guess you can mix and match with this still. I would say though, like overall, Everfrost is the better build, but if you want Rod of Ages, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Just scales a little slower. There are a lot of situational items, which we'll talk about down here. There's actually just so many of them. But first, let's talk about the mythics. So the other options on Galio are to go like Liandry's, Night Harvester, or Rocket Belt, basically. So I'm not a huge fan of Liandry's. I know some people pick this up on Galio, and the reason you might do it is despite the fact that it makes you quite squishy, it makes you really good at poking with Q, and it can be really good up against tankier teams. It's also nice because it gives you ability haste, but overall, I kind of think the only time I'd really pick this up is if like the solo AP and like they have a lot of tanks and there's no one else that can really kill them. And I feel like if you're in that sort of game, you probably shouldn't be Galio, but like maybe if you're a Galio one trick and you're blind picking them all the time, you end up in one of these games, it can be worth picking up the Liandry's, but it isn't something I go for often. Then our next two is Night Harvester and Rocket Belt. So these actually have higher win rates on Galio as far as I remember. They do give more AP and the stats on them are very, very nice, but I kind of think they miss a lot of like what actually makes these items good. So the problem with these, in my opinion, is they offer you like less build diversity in terms of your build path. So if you're going for Night Harvester, for example, you have to know that you basically don't need any defensive stats in your lane whatsoever. Like you're basically going full AP. There's no option for like a Kindle Gem. There's no option for Catalyst. Like obviously you've got this Ruby, which isn't the end of the world, but Alternator is kind of a trash item if I'm honest. So I really don't like the build path for Night Harvester, and I think it makes your lane a lot more difficult. But when completed, obviously it's a very good item. Like it does a lot of damage. Having ability haste is very, very nice. On the other hand, we have Rocket Belt. So Rocket Belt is kind of like your replacement for Ludens, because Ludens on Galio is like not great. But if you are the solo AP and you just want a lot of like all-in potential, you want to just like deal a lot of damage, it also helps like your engage, right? Because you can dash forward, then you can go Rocket Belt. Personally, I just think this is overall less consistent, and it's also more expensive. Like, again, it's like a fine item when you complete it, but it's missing like, it doesn't have like a lost chapter or a catalyst, so it doesn't have any of those like really strong laning items. It does spike very hard at one item. Like I'd say one item, it's probably stronger than either of these spikes. But I just don't really like it overall. I don't know. Like it's like completely fine on Galio, and like most of the mythics are at least viable. But I prefer Everfrost and Roa. I guess the time I might go this is if I'm like versus a bunch of squishies and I'm the solo AP, maybe I'll look for a build like something like Rocket Belt, Sork Shoes, Shadow Flame, Rabadons, I could go something like that maybe, but at the same time, in most of those games, I would be a different champ. Now, again, if you're blind picking Galio every game, like it might be an option for you, but it's not something I'd look for super often. Again, I guess just to reiterate though, they're not really bad. Like if you want to go Harvester and Rockabelle, like be my guest. I think this is a champ that can go basically whatever you want and it'll be fine. And as we talked about Rod of Ages, I think Rod of Ages might actually be the stronger mythic overall. But I just think the way solo queue plays out, Everfrost tends to be stronger. Like I think scaling in solo queue is nice, but it's not like, if it comes at a cost of like too much happens early game and you can't impact it, that's definitely bad. But it is really good for versing like difficult assassin matchups or even for difficult range matchups, just grabbing the catalyst for lane. Finally, our situational items. So we have like a million different items here, so we'll go through them all. First is Medjai's. As with every AP champion, like Medjai's when upgraded is extremely good. The movement speed's really nice for Galio, but the problem is I would probably not pick up Medjai's on this champ until you get other tank stats. So let's say you pick up a Darksteel early. I probably wouldn't pick up Medjai's until like at least after Zhonya's, because you have a pretty high chance of dying on Galio before your defensive items come through. And if you lose some Darksteel stacks, like that's whatever. But if you lose Medjai stacks, you're punished way, way harder. So if you are going to pick up this item, which I think is pretty greedy already, definitely don't pick it up until after you have defensive items and you have like Flash and Ghost up or something. Next is our healing reduction items. So Galio actually can upgrade Morello if you want. Like you can go Oblivion Orb and then say, replace one of these items with Morello. Again, I find myself not doing that much though, because I think like finishing Zhonya's, like the active is really, really nice. Cosmic as well, like it gives you basically everything you want. And you don't really, I guess you could fit it into like a Protobelt build or something where you want the magic pen. But overall, like the fact that this gives 40% Grievous anyway means I'm not picking it up. And also like, Galio doesn't apply magic or apply like Grievous wounds that well. Like he is AoE, but it's not like consistent AoE. You know, like you can throw your Q and you can miss it. You might get a 5-man taunt or you might not. It's not something like guaranteed where you're just going to apply a ton of AoE. So I don't like it that much. But maybe if you're like peeling an ADC, like let's say you're peeling, I don't know, your ADC and you're like CCing an Aatrox, like then you're always going to CC him, right? And always apply the Grievous. So there's an argument for it, but I don't think it's an amazing item. Next is Cosmic. So we have Cosmic in the build. Cosmic is situational though. Like you can replace it with other damage or defensive items if you want. I just like it though because it kind of smooths out the build, and having the movement speed and ability haste is really, really nice. But if you want to replace it with something, you can. I think it's really strong though, especially after the buff. Rylai's is another one. So I've seen Rylai's picked up a couple times on Galio, and the reason is because it allows you to kind of provide quite a lot of just like hidden CC in the fight almost. Like if you, let's say you have someone like hard engage in, right? Like you've got a Jarvan on your team, you got a Galio. If you ult on top of them, you know, you knock them up, then you can W after them. You can like Q them, so you can kind of layer your CC to where they're like perma stunned and like knocked up and slowed, which is really, really annoying. But like the stats on Galio aren't amazing, like no ability haste, a lot of HP, which is nice, but it's not like, you know, I think you'd rather have stuff like the actives from Zhonya's. So the good thing about it is it's cheap, and if you wanted to pick it up, I'd probably pick it up in this build. Like I don't think I would want to go say, or I suppose actually you don't really want it with Everfrost, like you don't want to stack the slows too much, but I guess you could pick it up here, but then you'd maybe have to delay Rabadons a bit more. So I don't know, I guess you'd be like Rod of Ages, Rylai's on your Rabadons, or maybe Rod of Ages, Rylai's Rabadons. I'm not too sure. I feel like it doesn't fit that well into the builds, but it is a decent item, and you could consider it like ultra late game if you didn't need like Rabadons or Void for the like MR shred or whatever. Shadow Flame. So Shadow Flame is your best like pen item if you are going for a build like Protobelt. You probably want to include a Shadow Flame in there. It's really good for burst, and if you know the fight's going to be really short, it could be an option. So you could go say like Protobelt, Sorks, Shadow Flame Rabadons, or even like Shadow Flame Zhonya Rabadons or something like that. I think that all works. Next is our Zhonyas and Banshees. So like every other champ, like these can be skipped if you don't need them and just replace them with damage items. But naturally, as like a melee champion, they tend to get a bit more value on you than other champs because you're always going to take damage. I think if you can look for Banshees, like Banshees is really valuable because it's actually a lot cheaper. And I actually find a lot of the time that the shield is quite useful for when you're engaging. But probably the Zhonya's active is overall better. But like, yeah, definitely if they're like loaded on AP or loaded on AD, these can be great. Or if you just need to like survive a little bit longer, they're good. After that, we kind of have our last three damage items, which are Rabadon's, Void, and Demonic. So Rabadon's Void, as with most other APs, you pick up Rabadon's when you have a lot of AP already, gives you a big damage spike. You pick up Void if they have a lot of magic resist. Now, this isn't going to happen that much when you're playing Galio, because most of the time, like, people won't itemize against you, just because you're more of like an off tank as opposed to like a full AP. But it'll happen sometimes, and you can consider picking it up later in your build. If you don't need it, though, a good way to kind of replace it is just with Demonic. So Demonic late game does quite a lot of damage, but it's quite hard to fit in the build. Like, you don't really want to replace any of these items. It's really just like, I guess if you didn't need like a defensive item late game and you find Void wasn't valuable, then you can look for Demonic. But overall, I think like other items are better. So that kind of makes it for most of the Galio items. The thing is, the reason the Galio items ended up so long is because there's a lot of options. But straight up, like, you can build mostly what you want on this champion and it's still going to be fine. Like, if you build one of these standard builds, again, you can like optimize with it for sure. And I encourage you to do so. But at the same time, like, you get 95% of the way there just by building one of these standard builds. I guess like the main thing is just to really like mix up your boots choices depending on the game. I think that's pretty important. And also your build path. Like, if you notice like you need more tankiness, go for like Kindle Gems or Catalysts. Or if you just want the AP, like if you can get the AP early, it allows you to clear waves quicker. So that's really important as well. But yeah, just experiment with it. And overall, like, you'll probably be fine if you just follow one of those. Now moving on to Galio's runes, there are 3 good rune pages, which are Aftershock, Spellbook, and Phase Rush. We'll go through them all. Personally though, I prefer Aftershock the most. I think it's like by far the easiest way to play Galio, and I think it just makes it so consistent. Like, you're just so tanky, and it also makes laning a lot easier as well, because you always have the resolve page, but we'll kind of go through them all and kind of discuss them, but I prefer the Aftershock page. Now, for your first rune choice here, there's a lot of stuff you can do, so I'd say Demolish or Shield Bash are probably your best two. If you're in a lane, especially against melees where you can push a lot, Demolish can be quite good. Or if you know your champion, the enemy champion you're playing against is going to roam a lot, then Demolish can allow you to punish roams if you're not able to follow the roam yourself, which doesn't happen that often because Galio is pretty good at chasing roams, but like, it's an option. Alternatively, like, Shield Bash is like slightly stronger for lane, but I honestly feel like both of these runes like don't really do a whole lot. Like, I don't know, they have minimal impact on the game, I suppose. After that, we have this line here, and you can, again, take all 3 of these, and they're very powerful. So up against all-in assassins, like, Bone Plating is very good, especially assassins that have no way of poking from range. So a champ like Fizz, this is extremely good against. A champ like Zed, it's still good against, but not as good, because they can just poke with Q, right? So that's, like, kind of what you're thinking. If you're against a, like, range champion, you probably want Second Wind. It makes a big difference to your lane. It has a lot of extra sustain. Would highly encourage picking it up. If you're in a lane where you feel like you don't need either, conditioning gets you a lot tankier. So honestly, all 3 of these are really valuable. It's kind of crazy how like terrible runes like these are, and then like how broken these ones are. So all 3 of these are really good. Conditioning is definitely the best scaling, but Second Wind or Bone Plating will make your lane a lot easier. Then down here at the bottom, your 2 choices really are Overgrowth or Unflinching. So if you really need extra tenacity, it can be worth taking Unflinching, especially because we don't really have any pages where we'll get Legend tenacity. Like, having a little bit of extra tenacity from runes can be really, really nice. But alternatively, like, going for Overgrowth is fine as well, and it will make you a lot tankier throughout the game. Now, for your secondaries, there's a lot of different stuff you can do as well. A lot of different options. So you're kind of, if you want the most scaling, Transcendence and Gathering Storm is probably your best bet. This gives you obviously the ability haste and the AP, so it makes you quite strong in the mid game. Now, if you're taking Aftershock and you're taking Flash Ghost as opposed to Flash TP, then you're going to take Nimbus Cloak. So I wouldn't take Nimbus Cloak with TP, but if you are running Flash Ghost, like, Nimbus Cloak is really, really valuable. It allows you to just chase people down so easily. The initial movement speed burst is extremely valuable. But yeah, not worth taking with TP, but if you're in an easier matchup and you can afford to take Ghost, then it's really, really nice. Another thing you can do is, if you want stronger early game, is you can go something like Cosmic DMAT. So having DMAT allows you to clear the backline a little easier if you just like DMAT 3 ranged or even 2 ranged and 1 melee, which is really, really nice. There's like loads of other stuff you can do with this. Like, you can go Futures Market if you really want to rush out a Catalyst. You could swap to Boots. Like, swap your DMAT to Boots if you want to just like rush your first item quicker. Cosmic is really nice for Summoner Spell cooldown. So there's like a lot of different options. Personally, I probably prefer this in most of my games. Probably this or maybe this. And then I guess if I'm running Ghost, I would go Nimbus Cloak. But they're honestly, again, they're all good. Like, you can't really go wrong with Galio runes in my opinion. Then down here we go for double AP. I really like double AP because it makes, again, like, killing the wave a lot easier. And I think that's really important on Galio, because if you fall behind, it can become quite hard to CS. But as long as you stay like ahead, it's actually quite easy and you can end up really far. And it's like kind of see a lot of noob Galios ending up like very far behind in CS. So it's like very important to think about that. I guess like one last thing you could maybe consider is water walking for early game. I don't like this as much because a lot of the time you'll just be ulting to other waves, or like you'll be just like fighting in the river as opposed to full roaming, but it's an option. I mean, if you want stronger early game, it's certainly an option. Now, other rune pages. So if you want to, like, let's say you have a matchup that's very hard early, but then gets a lot easier, you can go something like Spellbook and go something like this, either Magic Boots or Perfect Timing, and then perhaps go Resolve Secondary, maybe for a bit of scaling. This would allow you to like kind of take like TP for the early game and then swap to combat summoners for other fights. Or you can either take Ghost and then just like swap to TP at level 6. Again, if you are taking Ghost, or if you find yourself swapping to combat summoners like for every team fight, like you consistently do that, something like this is extremely valuable. I'd say it works very well with Spellbook because you are going to have combat summons a lot of the time. It also can be quite good up against like some of the longer range champs, like against something like Syndra. If you feel like you're never going to get the chance to Aftershock onto her, taking something like Ghost and swapping to TP can be very valuable, although then you might find yourself going something like this for a bit of a stronger early game. So I'd say don't take Spellbook too much on Galio, but it is like quite strong, and if you do like using Spellbook, like definitely consider it. And then obviously, just like before, we can swap DMATs and these around if we want. Now, the other page that I kind of find myself using fairly often is the Phase Rush page. So with this, you can go something like this. If you want more scaling, swap to Water Walking. If you want stronger early game, swap to Nimbus. If you're taking Ghost as well, otherwise go for the Mana Flow. So lots of options there. And now when you're running Phase Rush, you probably do want to run Resolve Secondary because this is a very greedy early game page. Like it doesn't really offer you anything. Like Phase Rush kind of sucks for early game. It's really just more of a scaling rune. And like, chances are, if you're running this page, you're not taking TP either, because again, you want to make use out of the fact that you're taking Nimbus. So I think if you're running this page, definitely need like second window bone plating to make it work. Times this could be good is if you're against like range champs that aren't like super hard bullies, but are still like difficult, and you don't really think that like the fights are going to be about your Aftershock. Like maybe you feel like they're going to be really long, so like having the Phase Rush movement speed to kite in and out is good. Or maybe you feel like you don't have the opportunity to engage anyway, stuff like that. So there are options, but overall, I really do prefer the Aftershock page. Like I think something like this is probably my favorite, like going for this or going for this. And then again, I will swap this to Nimbus for sure if I'm taking Ghost. Like that's one of the most important things to remember. If you are taking Ghost, make sure to pick up the Nimbus. Finally, we have Galio's Sum. So you're always going to want to pick up Flash. I mean, it's really helpful for engaging. Unfortunately, you can't W Flash anymore, but you can Flash W, which is still really, really useful. And then depending on your lane, you'll want to like choose your Sum. So most of the time, I would probably go for Flash TP because I think it makes the lane phase a lot easier. And I think it also makes it a lot easier to play the side lane. However, if you notice that they don't have very good ways to disengage or you don't need TP for lane, Flash Ghost is like way better for team fighting, especially as we said many times when combined with Nimbus Cloak. That can be a great pickup as well. I don't often find myself going something like Barrier because honestly, you don't really need it. Like you get very tanky, and especially with Aftershock, you should be able to tank up Assassins. But maybe if you can like peel your ADC, like if you saw that, for example, they have to dive your ADC if they like Hecarim Z or something, taking Exhaust and just sitting on your AD could work very well. Probably the only other thing I'd consider would maybe be Cleanse. If you were against like, I know, a Lysandra, I might pick it up. But even then, you might be better off taking Flash TP and just going like Cleanse, or sorry, like Merc Treads Unflinching or something like that. So yeah, I think go Flash TP if your lane is difficult, Flash Ghost if your lane is easy, and that'll do it like, yeah, for most of the games. Next, we have Galio's abilities. Let's start with the passive here. So Galio's auto attacks deal additional damage to surrounding enemies, and this effect has a 5-second cooldown. So there isn't too much to it. It's just something that you're going to look to weave in your combos when you can, and also it's kind of useful for wave clear, so you can kind of see here, I'll show you the range, so you should be able to hit all three of these targets here. Has a fairly decent range, but I wouldn't be able to say hit something over here, as you can see. So mainly going to be used for wave clear, but you do want to weave it into your combos as well. Your Q, which is your main harassing ability and your main farming ability, so it's very, very important, is basically you choose a target location and it sends like 2 Wind Blasts that deal initial damage, and then they also deal percent max health as magic damage over 2 seconds for people that are standing in the point of the end. So if, for example, if I Q this target here, you will see that this target on the side took damage from the from this kind of like wind, I guess, blast that goes through it. But then a lot of the damage also comes at the end. So the way you're going to use this is in lane, you can use it to harass your opponent. You can just like look to aim both parts on them. Other ways you might want to use it is if, for example, you want to CS a creep, but your opponent's standing to the side, is you can last hit the creep and you can hit your opponent with the sides of one of them. And also it can be used kind of with the rest of your combos, as we'll get to in the combo section, to kind of make sure you guarantee the damage. Next is W. So W first has a passive, which is Galio gains a magic shield after not taking damage for 12 seconds. Now, this is often forgotten by Galio players, but it adds up to a lot of additional damage in the laning phase if you can play around it. And I guess the reason it's forgotten is sometimes 12 seconds is too long to wait and you won't be able to take damage for that long. But if you can, like walking up and, you know, say taking a creep, taking a little bit of magic damage as a result, and then kind of waiting back, you know, farming with Q, waiting for your shield to come back up. A lot of the time that makes some very difficult lanes a lot easier. So don't forget about the shield. It is pretty important. The W active, though, is that you begin a channel which reduces incoming magic damage and physical damage. You also slow yourself, so if I kind of show here, you can channel up like this, so you're taking reduced damage. And then when it completes, so when you release it or after you hold it for, I guess, like 1.5 seconds or something, it deals damage and refreshes the damage reduction, and it also taunts the targets nearby. So you'll kind of see here that if I just, you know, charge this up, I can taunt all these targets in this area, and that will force them to attack me. Also, because it's a CC, it does proc Aftershock, which is going to be pretty important if you're running that. And it does do a little bit of damage as well. And the main skill with this is going to come from, you know, managing to hit multiple targets with it. You know, if you can get a good taunt that hits the majority of the team compared to just one member. And also the fact that it does give you damage reduction. Like, that's also forgotten about quite often. But you can be a lot tankier than you look on Galio if you use like your passive shield and the resistance from this as well. Next is Galio's E, and this is kind of a weird ability. So it says Galio lunges forward and he knocks up a enemy champion and deals damage to the first champion hit. Now, other enemies that aren't champions still get knocked up and they still take damage. So for example, if I am to like E this guy while going through the scuttle, you can see it still knocks it up, but it does reduce damage to it. And I guess the main reason for that is to make sure your wave clear is not too strong. But functionally, it doesn't really matter too much for you. The main thing is that you'll dash forward, you'll knock someone up. Again, it can proc Aftershock. There's a little kind of interesting thing with this, and that's the fact that you actually like dash backwards first. So you can kind of see here, you have that little dash backwards. That can be used a couple different ways. You can use it to dodge skill shots, and also you can use it to kind of knock people up quicker. So for example, if you're looking at someone like this, rather than comboing that way, you're probably better off comboing backwards because it's quicker. Yeah, I guess I'll talk about it more in the combo section, but just kind of know that's how it works. And finally, there is Galio's ult, Hero's Entrance. This, as you can see, kind of, yeah, you guys can see the minimap there. It's a pretty long range, and you target it on an ally, and then you grant them a shield, and then you fly to that area, knock everyone up, and deal damage. So this can only be used on allies, but you can see here, if I press R on them, you can also press R on their portrait if you have that. Press R on them, it will knock up and deal damage to all those targets nearby, and it allows you to easily CC them, which is obviously very nice. This is really, really strong if you combine it with other engaged champs. So if you're playing with something like a Jarvan or a Camille, those are kind of known as champions that synergize really well with Galio. Other examples being stuff like Relol, or even like a Nautilus engage, Leona engage, whatever. That's a great way to use it, or alternatively, you can use it to peel off someone as getting engaged on as well. As for which abilities you want to max, you want to put your points in Q first, then W, then E, and putting a point in alt whenever you can. In most lanes, you'll want to start Q first. However, there are some lanes where you might want to start E first. So those would be against like melee champions that are going to really heavily like punish you. You kind of just want to be able to trade back. And also, if you don't really need to kind of farm from range, so against like most range champs, for example, you'd want to start Q, like one to farm easier, and because like you can't really hit them with E. But yeah, some of those melees you can look to start E. And you might want to go, it kind of depends. Like, as I said, you max Q, then W, then E. But like a lot of the time you might want to do, say, like what people will do is they'll do like QEQ and then put a point in W, or they might do like QWQ and then put a point in E. It just kind of depends on your lane, but oftentimes 2 points Q earlier is nice because it allows you to clear that wave just a little bit easier. Galio's combos aren't too advanced, but there's a couple nice tricks that you guys would like to know. I think probably the first thing is just like how you're going to use your abilities in general. So like oftentimes in lane, you will just look to farm with Q like this, and that allows you kind of to not walk up to the wave. The thing is, it kind of depends a lot whether you use Q or auto, depending on like what you can actually, I guess, get without taking damage. Like for example, if your opponent allows you to walk up and auto the melees with Q, then that can be really nice, and that allows you to save Q for the range creeps. The problem is that's just like not going to happen a lot of the time if you are against good players, but if you can get away with it, it's kind of nice. If you kind of get a wave that's uncontested and like no one's really there, normally what you want to do is kind of like want to group up the minions as much as possible, that so you can Q and auto them all down. And then what you can do is like, once they get lower, you can kind of E through them to last hit a bunch of them as well. There's a variety of different ways you can like set this up, to be honest. And it really just depends like how much time you have. Like, I guess if you have the most time in the world, probably what you'd want to do is actually just start with an auto, since that's going to be the one that comes off cooldown first. You know, like walk up, do something like this, wait for them to kind of all get low again, and then maybe go for another auto Q. Basically, it doesn't really matter too much what order you do, like the wave clear in, as long as you kind of are, I guess, like using your passive to its full effect to make sure you last hit creeps and just like group them up if possible. Now, for actual trading, there's a couple different ways. One way, obviously, is just to poke your opponent. So you can look to Q-poke your opponent whenever they go to CS. The problem with that is it is quite easy to avoid, and most of the time you're only going to hit with one part of it. Worth noting, though, is that one part actually does quite a lot of damage. Like, even if you just hit your opponent with, like, the glancing side of it, it actually does quite a bit of damage. So it is, I guess it's like, you should try and make sure if you're once you're like hitting the CS, if you can hit your opponent at the same time, like if you can do something, I don't know, like this, for example, you hit your opponent at the same time, that's really, really nice. But a lot of the time your damage isn't going to come from that. And so the way you're going to instead want to trade is if they ever are like kind of out of position and you can hit them with an E, you want to open with that. So you hit the E, and then there's like two different things you can kind of do with this as well. So if you just want to take like a short trade and disengage, like let's say your Q is on cooldown or something, right? You might just want to E auto them, you know, and then just like walk out after that. And that doesn't give them much room to kind of reply, right? But if you have all your cooldowns up and you're looking for a full trade, what you'll probably want to do is you'll want to just like E, W, and then like Q auto. Now you can weave in an auto sort of. So I'll show you. Like if you auto straight away, like if you E auto W, the problem with this is that you won't finish the full charge before they can like dash or flash. So you definitely don't want to do that against champs that can disengage. Because if you end up missing out on the like Q damage because you like try to greed with the extra auto, it's normally not going to be worth it. So just keep that in mind versus champs that can dash. It's normally better just to go on them like this and then hit the Q auto, and then you can walk out after that. And normally that trade will be really, really good for you, especially if you have aftershock or bone plating or something like that. Another way you can trade is if your opponent just like walks up too far, is you can look to kind of like W early, and then you can kind of like E. You can either auto Q or Q auto. Again, it really depends like what you want to do after. Like for example, you might want to just like W, like Q auto, and then like E away or something, you know? So a lot of the time with these Galio combos, like, yeah, the highest damage combos will always be to make sure they're CC'd by either your E or your W so that you can maximize the Q damage and fit in as many orders as possible. But you always got to be thinking like, do I want to do the max damage, or am I just like trying to deal some damage and get out? Because the thing with Galio is that most of the time you don't win like long trades and you can't kill your opponent that often. You're more just like setting up chunk to allow for ganks and stuff. Now, speaking of ganks, you can't W flash anymore. So something you used to be able to do was you could channel and then you could flash. Unfortunately, that just does not work anymore. You can still flash W. So for example, if you are setting up a gank and you notice your opponent is like too far up, you can do something like this, and then you can either full channel or you can cancel it early and just follow up with an E. All of that works fine for gank setup. One thing that I think is worth keeping in mind is that if you do have Nimbus Cloak, or if you are just running Ghost in general, something you can do is you can actually just Ghost early, and then you can sometimes get their flash and still kind of catch up to them just with the movement speed. So that can be kind of nice because that allows you to save your flash to gank them later. And it can even mean that they just like waste flash for no reason. Let's keep that in mind as well. You can also Q flash on this champion, so it isn't like that often that you're going to do this, but if you do want to try last hit a kill, you can Q flash, which I'm not even sure if I've ever killed someone with Q flash in Galio. I must have at some point, but anyway, it's a combo that you can do. I wouldn't worry about it too much though, unless someone's like really low under their tower or something. And the only other combos that really matter is like stuff with Everfrost. So let me just get some gold here. So if you have Everfrost, you can weave that into pretty much any part of your combo. So like for example, or actually let's say you're like cheesing in a bush, there's like a variety of different ways you can start this, right? You probably want to start it with a W, then follow up with like an Everfrost order, and then like maybe EQ after. Alternatively, you might want to weave in the Q earlier. Like if you're really worried about them dashing out and not getting all the damage off, you might want to do something like this. W, Q Everfrost, and then E auto. It really, again, depends on if your opponent can get out or not. Just always be considering like the extra Q damage for them standing in it is nice, but it's it's like, don't think so much about the max damage combo in Galio, because most of the time you're not there to do damage, you're just there to kind of get as much CC out as possible. And like, if for example you're trying to engage on someone and you know, like let's say you have 3 people in this bush, right? You know that this person dies no matter what, no matter how much damage you do. All you need to do is kind of like make sure your CC lasts as long as possible. So what you might want to do is fully charge a W, then Q them, wait for this to, or yeah, weave in the Q, wait for this taunt to run out, as you can see the bar there, and then Everfrost them, and then E them. You know, you might just want to guarantee as much CC as possible. So keep that in mind as well. You're mainly a CC champ, not a damage champ. And I guess the last things that are kind of useful is to remember that you always want to try and use your ult to kind of follow up CC. It's really easy to just like use your ult and have it not really do anything, but if you either follow up CC or you engage on, or you kind of like peel someone that is being engaged on, those are much easier ways to hit your R. I think that's all the Galio tips and combos I can remember. There might be some others, and if there are any, please leave them in the comment section below. Normally when I do make these videos, there are so many and I just kind of forget to put in some, even if I do know them. So please let me know if there are others I forgot. Galio's lane phase is very dependent on a couple different factors. The first is your jungler. So if you have a ganking jungler like a Rek'Sai, Jarvan, Zinzal, Vi, etc., one of these champs, you're going to find your lane to be a lot easier because you can set up ganks really well for them. If you have something like a Lilia or an Evelynn or a Kayn, you're going to find the lane to be a lot harder because, well, there's going to be no help for you. So Galio is much better with ganking junglers, and please do keep that in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that if you're against a melee champ early, you normally can be pretty aggressive. So this is an example of a melee matchup, and we'll talk through this one before we go to a range matchup. So in most melee matchups, you can get priority early. If you're against something that's really good at extended trades, something like a Yasuo or an Aurelia, you might not be able to. Again, a little bit dependent on like how much threat your jungler has. But against most other assassins like a Zed or a Fizz, Katarina, you know, all this sort of stuff, normally you can kind of get prior early. And the thing with Galio is that the prio is sort of a luxury. You don't really need to get priority early. Like, you're not looking to really build a big lead over your opponent. You're mainly kind of focused on playing around your jungler. Now, whether that's invading with your jungler or like setting up for them, it kind of depends. So like if you have something like a Kindred, right, you might want to try and hard push for priority, because that way you can like assist them on all their invades or something. Whereas if you're playing with something like a Jarvan, you know they're probably not going to invade. Instead, they're probably going to set up ganks, so you might want to freeze the wave instead. Now here I did have priority up against the Fizz anyway, and so I was able to use this priority to just come over and get the Shaker here. So most of your pre-6 versus melees is going to look something like this, where either you are pushing those first 3 waves, and then you can either look to freeze it from there, or you can even just like freeze from the beginning. Basically, melee lanes are pretty easy. You can basically do whatever you want. Now, your early game, if you're versus an assassin and you have TP and they don't, one thing you can look to do is just kind of trade all your HP and then TP back. That's just kind of a feature of TP in general. So something you'll see that kind of happens here is Fizz and we trade quite a bit of damage back and forth, but I have TP and he doesn't. So what I'm able to do, I TP back, I just grab some amp tomes, and then it's very difficult for him to match me in lane. You can see I've come back with sustain, he doesn't have any corrupting pulse left, and so it's very easy for me to really heavily trade on him, as you can see here. Another thing you should keep in mind, especially versus melee champs, is trading with bone plating up is very, very OP. So most melee champs can't proc your bone plating, which is very good. And bone plating, it just mitigates so much damage if you trade while it's up. So worth keeping that in mind. You can see here that I am able to just like keep him forced under tower. Now, whether you're playing a melee lane or a range lane, once you hit level 6, things will change quite a lot for you. Like, the thing with Galio is that pre-6, you don't want to roam too much, because if you roam early and you fall behind, or even if you roam early and it's successful, sometimes it'll mean that you will be too far behind in your 1v1 to actually catch up. So you want to be a bit careful, like how much you're roaming. But once you hit level 6, you can always like roam with ulti, and that saves quite a bit of tempo. It's very quick, so you can always, you know, make a play and then often get back to the lane in time. Plus, it's like a lot more successful. I just wanted to say here as well, you can see that because I used that TP advantage really well, I was up at 21 CS after my first base, which is really, really nice. And I was going to go for a reset here, but I believe, oh no, I did go for a reset. I thought I altered bot there. Now, as you can see, once you get a bit more AP, I guess there's like a little bot play here. I'm just going to skip over this because it's not too important. Once you get a bit more AP, you can see it's like really easy to one-shot waves. So this is once you've got points in queue, you know, once you're level 6, once you've got some items. Once you get to this point, you can look to just like spam roam pretty much. You don't want to roam without pushing. Now, one thing I see a lot of Galios do, and like you can roam without pushing if it's a really good roam, like if you want to ult somewhere or something, or if it's really good. But something that like a lot of bad Galios do is they end up like really low on CS. And I think that it like doesn't really have to be like that on Galio. You know, like you have enough push and enough wave clear that you can pretty safely farm waves and roam pretty much non-stop. And there's also a point where I believe it's like level 8 where your Q, and depending on how much AP you have, obviously, where your Q will actually start to one-shot the backline. Yeah, so not quite here for me. I believe it's on the next wave. Let's just see. Do I one-shot this backline? I want to see now. I'm invested. Not quite. Okay, so when you get a bit, when you get enough AP, right, you're able to one-shot this back wave. And once you get to that point, that's like really, really important for your wave clear because one, it means that you can roam even quicker because you don't have to Q auto the wave like I'm doing here. But also because it just like makes CSing really easy. Like if your Q just literally one-shots the backline, you only have to worry about CSing. And I'm kind of going off on a tangent now, but I think as well, like Galio is a champ where if you fall behind, it becomes really hard to CS on this champ because your Q no longer does enough damage. You can't contest the side lane, and just because like everyone can force you off too easily, right? But if you get ahead and you stay ahead, farming actually becomes quite easy because you one-shot waves just so quickly. Like I'm assuming here with Everfrost and 5 points Q that I can one-shot these. Yeah, looks like I can. So once you get to this point, right, like CSing is really easy, even if you're really bad at CSing. So yeah, we're kind of going off on a tangent. Basically, for melee matchups, you will want to either look to set up ganks or push for prio, depending on what you want in those first 3 levels. And then from then on, you're mainly looking to play around your jungler, like either setting up ganks for them, invading if they want to invade. Once you hit level 6, that's when you can start looking to really roam. As you get more wave clear and more AP, it becomes easier and easier. So melee matchups overall are kind of easy. Now we'll take a look at a range matchup. So most range matchups are pretty difficult for you. Some notable examples being champs like Anivia or Syndra or stuff like that. Worth noting again is that a lot of these matchups are very dependent on your junglers. So as I'll show you in another example a bit later, if you verse a champ like Syndra, right, the 1v1 is very difficult. But if you have a champion like Jarvan, you know, that makes team fighting really hard for Syndra. It makes playing after level 6 really hard for Syndra. You always have gank threat onto them. And so that can make those sorts of matchups playable. But if you play those sort of matchups without any pressure from your jungler, it's going to be basically impossible. So you can see here, I'm just trying to farm with Q. I'm trying to not take too much damage. This is very, very important, especially if you don't take TP. I would recommend taking TP, but I think I was taking Ghost Nimbus here because I thought I needed it versus their comp or something. I actually can't quite remember why. But anyway, I don't have TP here, so I need to be quite careful. I also want to make sure I use my W shield if possible. You can kind of see here the way I'm angling my Q is to still hit the creeps, but also hit my opponent if they walk into it, you know, if they walk too far up. And basically, yeah, like in range matchups, you unfortunately don't have a lot of agency. You're just trying to make sure you keep your CS up, you know, don't take too much damage for free. Try and last hit the creeps with Q if you can. If you ever get the opportunity to auto the wave, you should, because it'll save you mana. And normally with Doran's Ring, like you won't run out of mana unless you're literally using Q on cooldown, but like any mana that you can save is really, really nice. One thing I want to quickly add here is that this is like a range versus or a melee versus range concept anyway, but it's useful in Galio too, is if you can, try and like bait out cooldowns out of your opponent. So most often people will try and use cooldowns when you go for a CS, right? So you can kind of see when I walk up to this creep here, I like deliberately walk at it before like moving to the side, because I know that like Anivia wants to Q me here and she's probably expecting me to walk up and auto this creep. But in most melee versus range matchups, it's worth giving up a creep every now and then, just to make sure like you don't take too much damage. So you can see basically here what I did is like I dodged the first cooldown. I managed to farm most of this wave here with Q. I did unfortunately take a couple autos. There's nothing I can do about this. I do have second wind to sustain it, and my magic shield ate the last bit of damage. So that was like mitigated as much as possible. Unfortunately, the trade is still not favorable for you. That's just like how these matchups work. But yeah, and then after 6, it's pretty much going to be the same as the other matchups. You get a lot more wave clear. You can start roaming around. I think this Anivia greeted her base for super long, so I was able to get her really low. But yeah, like you can see, at some point, I start getting priority. And a lot of the time, even if you shouldn't get priority, sometimes you will, because they should have to be scared of your jungler. Now, this wasn't a case of that, but you'll see it again in another example. So this example here is one where I'm playing Galio against Cassiopeia, which is a very tough matchup, right? But I have a Pike and I have a Jarvan, which means that playing this lane should be pretty difficult for Cassio, and it also means that team fighting should be really tough for her. So I actually started D-Ring, or D-Shield in this matchup. This is Cassio specific because she's a dot champion. So Cassio, Brand, Mal's champs like that, although you don't need it versus Mal's. You can look to go with Dorn Shield because it allows you to sustain a lot of extra damage because it keeps ticking. Now you can see here what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to lean to the opposite side. Normally you try and hug to the side your jungler's on, but if the wave is pushing to you, you hug to the opposite side and instead try and set up a gank. So you can see Jarvan coming from top side, I hug to the bot side here, and then I'm able to look for some sort of gank. Now this doesn't have to be a kill, even just a chunk is nice. You can see here she actually ghosted and flashed. I don't know what that was about, but anyway, and that turns a lane that is, really, really difficult for you into like a somewhat playable matchup, right? Like now, she doesn't really have the health to kind of back this up. There was some kind of weird stuff here where we had some invade, and then eventually, like, Cassio, I believe, got killed here by Pike. I flashed on her, so I know she doesn't have any sums. Pike committed flash as well, and we got a kill. So, all good. Then we come back to lane. Jarvan looks for another gank. So when you get your opponent's flash like this, you know they're pretty gankable for pretty much the entire time they have no flash, especially if you have a pink. Like I had a pink in this bush here, you would have seen a moment ago. And that means that, yeah, she's like really, really gankable. Now here, I think I probably slightly misplayed. Not too sure. Let me have a look back at it. I think I might have needed to wait my E just a little longer. Yeah, because the thing is, like, I didn't get the E knock up here. That meant we didn't have as much CC. I think this should still be a guaranteed kill if Jarvan just walks away. Like, I can clearly just auto Cassiopeia here. Unfortunately, Jarvan did end up dying. However, this is still quite good for me. And another thing is, like, because this wave is still frozen, you can see that she will still be gankable when she returns to lane, and that's quite important. Again, in these matchups, you're not looking to really use your prior super early in the game. You're instead just looking to keep the wave in like a favorable spot. Unfortunately, there I had to let it crash because I roamed to this play, but otherwise I would have kept it frozen. And poor Cassio, I mean, this is kind of just the reality of playing a mobile mage versus a ganking mid jungle. And that's kind of why, like, you'll see it on my matchup tier list later. Like, a lot of these matchups are quite bad in the 1v1. But the thing is, like, for champs like Galio or Ari, LeBlanc, like, the matchup should never really be a 1v1. And again, like, when you're blind picking Galio, a lot of it can kind of come down to what you've already seen. Like, would I just like first pick blind pick Galio? I would say probably not. But if I had like a Jarvan and say like a roaming support, like a Pike or Nautilus already on my team, I would say I probably would. Because then it's like no matter what matchup they pick, I'm still gonna have like ganks it up. I'm still gonna have roaming and ganking champs on my team, and that's gonna make that matchup more playable. So hopefully that kind of like clears up some ideas in laning phase. Do I die here? No, I don't. For you guys, I guess the main things to remember don't grieve for prior too early. It's completely fine to just like sit back and set up jungle ganks, especially until you're after level 6. That's when you kind of get more prior. And the other thing is like really try not to fall behind in CS too much. You can see here I actually have very low CS because we're fighting a lot, but normally it's really important to keep your CS up, just as any champ, but Galio especially, because if you fall behind, like you're a melee, you aren't really as tanky as you should be, and it becomes much harder to CS. So keep all those things in mind. Team fighting on Galio is not too difficult, but it is something that just kind of takes a little bit of practice. One thing I like to think of before the team fight even starts is, do I want to dive or do I want to peel for my AD? Now, if your AD is really fed and they're like the only person on your team is fed, you almost certainly want to peel for your AD. But if you have engage tools, and especially if their ADC or mid is fed, you probably want to engage instead. So this is an example of when I'm playing with a Camille and Diana, which makes it extremely easy. All I really need to do is press R on the Diana ult and basically just chase the engage with my CC tools. So this is an example of basically your best possible situation when you've got something like that Camille, Jarvan, other champs, we talked about them earlier, other supports like Leona, Nautilus, or even stuff like Kai'Sa can be really good to kind of follow up on. And that makes it really easy, obviously, but let's take a look at some other examples as well. If you take a look at this example here, it's not immediately clear whether or not you should engage or peel, but I think in this situation, it's kind of better to engage. And the reason I'd be thinking that is like, while my Xayah and Lulu are like fairly strong, Xayah hasn't reached 2 items, which is her really big spike. And also there isn't a lot of threat onto Xayah anymore anyway. They've got a dead Shaco, Fizz is 1-4, so it's just not enough damage. And while there isn't like a great engage tool, again, something like a Jarvan to follow up on, like a Rek'Sai Flash knockup is still like decent enough. So if I see an opportunity, I'll probably look for it. So here we actually end up taking out the drag. And then I believe I actually start my reset because I thought the play was completely over. So I just begin my base here, and everyone was like down and walk away, but I noticed that Rek'Sai went in, and once I saw that there were 2 knocked up here, I looked to follow up with my ulti, and then I'm kind of just looking to CC as many targets as possible. You'll want to try and use like your Everfrost, your stopwatch, and your other abilities just to kind of like buy more time as well. Sometimes you won't actually be able to reach people, but even then, like it can be fine just to kind of CC people up or waste people's time on the side of the fight. You can also look to flank his Galio. So here I noticed there were too many people up on the mid wave. So I just flash Everfrost for the slow. I'm able to catch 2 people in my W here, and that kind of just allows my teammates to follow up and engage. And then we can kind of just chase them down. You can also just kind of use your W as I do here to, if you ever notice someone like TPing in or something like that, you can take them out. So there I ulted Ophelia just for the shield, and then I just W to taunt Poppy as soon as she came out. And now not often will you start a fight like this as Galio, to be honest. Like you might start it with a flank from a bush, but just by looking for a flash Everfrost is pretty uncommon. I guess what I'm just trying to show you is that there's like a variety of different options on Galio, but at the same time, like try not to get overwhelmed. Like you don't really need to make a play like this. You could definitely just, wait for your teammates to engage and kind of look to peer your ADC or whatever, and you'd still have pretty consistent results. It's more that like when you have flash, you can look to do something a little bit extra with it. And this last one here, what I think you should also think about is who actually the most important targets are in a fight. So not always will you have the opportunity to hit everyone, but when you do have the opportunity to go for multiple people, you want to think about like who is actually the most important here, right? So here what I could have done is I could have like tried to chase Milio past these Jinx traps, but instead like all I really need to do is make sure Jinx is CC'd. And again, like if you'd made the mistake of Eing Milio here, Jinx would have kept DPSing and then might have actually been able to clean this up. But because I went on Jinx, we know that once Jinx damage is gone, no one else really has damage here. So like again, while you're like in the team fights, the big broad concepts for you to keep in mind is basically like who do I want to engage on, and like do I need to peel or do I need to like go forward or whatever. But kind of within that, who you're using your cooldowns on is kind of the difference between like a good Galio and a great Galio. And in my team fighting video, one thing I kind of stress is that I think it's really important to number people like 1 to 5 before fights in terms of like who is most important and who is least important. I think over time, you just kind of like naturally like know who's important and who's not. But sometimes like using cooldowns on the wrong target is like potentially fight losing. Even if like it's nice to CC the enemy mid, sometimes like you might have to CC the enemy AD or you'll just lose. This is my opinion on Galio's mid matchups. For the most part, the champs that you're going to struggle with are champions that have either a lot of range or a lot of extended damage or are very difficult to gank. So like champs like Aurelia, for example, just very strong in the 1v1, can even sometimes 1v2. Lucian and Tristana just destroy you in the 1v1, have a dash on top of that. So those can be very difficult. But the thing is with Galio matchups in general is, as I said, all throughout this guide, is they're very dependent on your jungler. So if you're playing against something like a Syndra or an Orianna, they might actually be easy if you have the right tools. If you are playing a comp like something like Camille, Jarvan, and then a roaming support like Pyke or Nautilus or Leona, it's going to be impossible for them to play these champs. So it's always like, I don't know, the 1v1 is bad, but throughout the game, I think honestly is pretty good. There are some other ones on here that have kind of like, they might be fine in lane, but then become really difficult as the game goes on. Examples being Corki and Kale, they don't really do much to you, at least until level 6. After 6, though, they start getting more difficult, and then team fights, they're an absolute nightmare for you. But yeah, like if you snowball the game by then, it shouldn't be a problem, obviously. Kind of same goes for champs like Mal's and Veigar. So again, in the 1v1, it's quite easy, but can be very difficult. There are also a lot of champs on here that can, if they abuse you at certain windows, can be very tough. So an example would be Katarina is very good at all-ending at level 2. Fizz, if you die before buying any sort of defensive stats, is, can snowball out of control really, really hard. A champion like Ziggs can punish you really hard if you're bad at roaming. So if you end up losing to one of these champs that are a bit lower on the list, like obviously it's personal opinion as well, but it might tell you a little bit about what you might be struggling at in your gameplay, or it also might mean that you've just picked Galio with the wrong champs in your team. I think Galio in general is better as a counter pick, although again, like you can blind pick him if your team has already kind of picked diving or threatening champions. So that's kind of my opinion on it, but just again, keep in mind, disclaimer really, that a lot of these matchups are very heavily dependent on your jungle and support. So guys, that's going to be it for my full in-depth Galio guide. If you do have any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Make sure as well to check out my Twitch. I am streaming on there a couple days a week, not super often, but often enough that you're going to want to go follow it. So once again, thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.